I'm unemployed. Moving on. Okay, so why am I here talking to you right now? The goal of this presentation is to discuss some of the remaining hurdles that need to be overcome in order to build a full-on peer-to-peer web. Starting with I want to break it down into two sections. We got what are we in, and then what's next. So before we do that, sorry, I don't know if, actually, let me quickly check. Is there a like white screen before it shows the PDF on your end, or does it just immediately show it? I just kind of want to know if I should wait for it to load on my end, or if I should just keep going. Let's see, I see a flash of white. Okay, so other people see it too. Okay, no worries. But yeah, so I wanted to appreciate you all for a second. First, thank you to the organizers for putting this together. This is amazing. And I said remaining hurdles earlier because the organizers and contributors that built this ecosystem have already conquered so many. And your work inspired a lot of the principles and ideas that are going to that you'll be hearing near the end of this presentation. That is to say, I've been learning a lot from all of you. So thank you. And if you're joining us today and are new to Hypercore or peer-to-peer in general, I hope this talk gets you interested in contributing and gives you an idea of where to start. Okay, so let's actually get started. What are we in? Surprise! Actually, I had to make a last-minute change to this section, and I'll explain why. So before the conference, I tried practicing with some of my friends and family to make sure I was prepared, and it quickly became apparent that the presentation was a little hard to follow. After they all gave pretty much the same feedback, I realized that condensing entire branches of physics, philosophy, politics, and computer science into a 30-minute talk might be a little dense. Who knew? Not me, apparently. And in case you're curious, this is the monstrosity of a model that I was going to be constructing for What Are We Here? Honestly, after the discussion about digital sovereignty earlier, I think this is actually kind of elementary for a lot of you. But nonetheless, thanks to my friends and family, you have all been spared from a tedious look at each of these structures, from property ownership all the way to the web, and assessing not only how they function internally, but also how they continuously shape each other over time. Instead of putting you through all that, the abridged conclusion that I'm just going to give you is that these structures, through their interactions, produce a compounded force that is inherently resistant to peer-to-peer, which means in order for peer-to-peer to mature as a technology and have a bright future, we need to generate an opposing force that doesn't just react to the current one, but negates it. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that there's like a bunch of individual actors that are actively working against peer-to-peer or anything. It's just that the stronger forces in these systems, such as like private corporate interests, for example, aren't incentivized to encourage peer-to-peer, which can cause problems for us at points where our interests can conflict with theirs, you know? Besides this section being too convoluted, originally, I also realized, again, especially after the sovereignty conversation, that it would have been pretty redundant for a lot of you, I feel, since we're all kind of interested in this technology. And also, actually, I want to give credit where credit is due as well. There was a wonderful conversation about inclusivity in indexing that was super cool. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat for a second. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, you know, so basically, long story short, I cut 2 weeks of research out of my talk. Not sure what I'm going to do with that information now. You know, maybe you know, maybe I'll put it into a book or something. But jokes aside, if you want to discuss any of this further, feel free to message me on my Twitter or Discord. My username is on my book. That's what all the cool authors do these days. Okay, focus time, for real, I promise. So with the big tangent out of the way, we return to our original question. What are we in? The answer to that is basically global internet monopoly. All right, cool. So now we can get into what happens next. So these are the challenges I think that the consequences of kind of being in this larger structure we can more apparently see are brought to what we're trying to do. And I kind of like take a step back. I'm specifically talking about like challenges as they relate to the power structure, rather than like more technically oriented things like, for example, identity verification or like consensus decision making, which are necessary efforts in their own right, just not in the scope of this talk. Also, other very important things I'm leaving out of this list are topics that have kind of been explored more during this conference, like the interoperability discussion from yesterday, or problems and solutions that are kind of already being actively worked on in the space. And if you see anything, if you feel that there's anything missing, please let me know. You know, I would love to bring that forward in the discussion. So, oh yes, blog post. That's a good idea. Okay, so let's start with mobile because that's more in my wheelhouse, and so so naturally I'd want to start with it. But also, it's become a very significant portion of the internet. Not only that, but people are being pushed more towards mobile to the point where a growing number of people don't even have a computer. Not only because of the convenience of a mobile device, but also because many people can't really afford to have both. And the larger force is just kind of nudging them towards having a mobile device. So there's a massive amount of people that are completely new to this stuff that are able to be reached through this medium. Oh, Jeremy says mobile is 90% of Facebook's revenue. Yeah, there you go. That's indicative enough right there. That is bonkers. But so anyway, so here are some of the challenges with mobile that we're going to be going over real quick, mainly through the lens of gateway, since that's what I'm working on. To start, there's a lot of walls built into the DNA of the mobile environment compared to what you see with desktop, especially on iOS. This includes stronger ties between OS and hardware than what you see on PC. There's a clearer divide between apps whose external communication is heavily mediated by the OS, which can cause problems with ideas like having some sort of mobile hyperdaemon of some kind, for example. And on top of that, apps themselves are black boxes whose code or even files aren't meant to be shared or replicated. So one thing that I love about the hyper stack or hypercore in general that Beaker demonstrated when I was initially looking into it was like the ability to fork, copy, and remix other people's modules and applications, and that's completely negated within the within this kind of mobile ecosystem. So the way Gateway is tackling this issue is by basically just trying to carve out as uncompromising of a space as possible for anything that's created using hypercore. Basically, I'm trying to have Gateway take all the hits and do all the dirty hacks and workarounds so that hopefully someone who publishes content on a hyperdrive or makes an app using a program like Beaker doesn't have to worry about mobile. It can just work and by extension, reach more people. This is actually pretty much the main guiding principle behind Gateway. I don't want it to just be limited to traditional hyperdrives either. Nothing would be cooler to me than people being able to access like a Cabal chat on their mobile device while also being able to use different clients, that could be remixed and also made from scratch. Especially once Gateway adds support for peer-to-peer push notifications, which is something I'm pretty excited about. Also, side note, Cabal is also working on their own mobile app, I believe, and I'm really excited to see what that is because I love Cabal. So now we're going to move on to the next thing. And that is the physical limitations. Paul briefly brought this up yesterday. But yes, while at this point, even a budget smartphone seems to handle the hyperstack pretty well from the tests I've done, there is the unknown on the battery life. I can't really comment much on it because we're not at that point yet. But there's also hard-coded performance limitations in the OS that people might not be aware of, such as both iOS and Android being increasingly strict about how long apps are allowed to be running in the background, regardless of how much resources they're taking. It's more just a hard time thing, it seems. I do think that there could be workarounds through like, maybe enabling the GPS or microphone to trick the OS into keeping the app open. But that would definitely freak users out, if they saw their GPS or microphone was just active without their input. Plus, it probably wouldn't do the battery issue any favor. So as of now, there's not really a viable solution there. And so to remedy it for now while we figure things out, Gateway is going to try to keep things relatively thin in terms of replicating and hosting by outsourcing those functions to the desktop. And let me be clear, this does not mean I plan to make a Gateway desktop browser. I think with how well Beaker and Agrigor are coming at the desktop front from two different angles, Beaker being focused on developing a more computational database ecosystem that's akin to an OS, and Agrigor being a more minimal and modular. I don't really see a reason for Gateway to exist on the desktop, but I definitely want to work on some sort of desktop sync with the other hypercore browsers. And I also think something could be done here using DatDot's tool set. That's something that interests me a lot, but I don't really know what that would look like yet. All right, next challenge for mobile is app distribution. The OS is tied to its respective app store. So I'd compare the different app stores in terms of hard and soft power. Hard power just means it's like more overt or forceful, while soft power tends to be more subtle, coercive. And Apple, yeah, they straight up don't allow apps to be downloaded through like Safari and installed, which I believe you at least could have done on Android. I know Android's kind of going in the direction Apple has been over time, so I don't quite know where they're at now. But you still like, but Android, still kind of gets users to stick with Google Play, even though there's options like F-Droid that exist. And also with certain forms of encryption being illegal in certain countries, these app stores don't list apps using that cryptography in those countries, which can put a lot of users at risk. And could potentially pose a problem for peer-to-peer in the long term if something that if the cryptography we're using were to be at risk. And don't get me started on the review process. If you want to know more about that, I recommend a Twitter thread that Andre from Scuttlebutt wrote about his experience getting Manyverse on the App Store. Let's just say it wasn't the easiest process. But so how is Gateway tackling that? All I can say right now publicly is that there's a plan and we'll see how it goes. But we're gonna, you should talk about Andre. Oh yeah. I don't know if this message was sent. Johan was suggesting that I talk about Andre Stelz from Manyverse. Yeah, he was actually incredibly helpful when I was figuring out how to get a lot of the native Node modules to work initially, since he made so much headway on like Node.js mobile specific libraries. And yeah, the way he structured Manyverse was a big inspiration for how I approached Gateway initially. So yes, Andre's fantastic work. All right, next we have development challenges. So because the mobile space doesn't have peer-to-peer on its radar or really in its interests, there's a lot you need to figure out to get started with it. Luckily, I saw in the IRC chat that I think it was last week. I believe so. I think it was Mapio, if I'm not mistaken. Someone posted that they had made a repo that was a getting started guide for hyper applications on at least Android. I don't know about iOS, which will hopefully make it easier for people to jump into the process without needing to reverse engineer multiple other apps and learn a bunch of little tricks. And there's kind of two directions you can go at the moment. The way Gateway does it, and as well as Manyverse and I believe Mapio, is the Node.js mobile approach. That's a library that basically provides a node process running in your stack. And the library's come a long way. It works really well. The only bottleneck is kind of the message system. You don't want to get too clogged. But if you're like one of our events organizers, Martin, you can go ahead and create an incredible library for the random bytes crypto function that just works with everything. He's a mad genius. I don't know how he does it, but yeah, if you want, you can do that approach as well. And yeah, as I said before, Gateway is built on Node.js Mobile. And at this point, I would say that it's the bridge between WebV rendering, React Native, and Node is pretty robust, and overall a pretty solid foundation to work on. And now we can move on outside of mobile. So let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, network providers. I'll let the slide speak for itself. Simply put, they're not great. I can't speak for other countries, but American ISPs are able to charge you whatever they want. You don't have a lot of options, and they're no strangers to throttling peer-to-peer activities just across the board, even. Luckily, I think there's a clear solution here. Mesh networks. It seems like it's just perfect since they both thrive on a local level, and they both form networks that are dependent on mutual collaboration. This can be a great starting point for a web architecture that can begin the process of cutting service providers out of the equation. Just like how data is already negating servers. There's even community-run mesh network projects like Toronto Mesh that I'm aware of that have adopted IPFS for some of their architecture. So we're not alone in this thought. I also think mobile is a good front for to start testing the waters on this, since there's existing interest and capability in apps that use mesh for offline chat. And I believe Manyverse has a mesh option on at least Android. I'm not sure if it's on iOS. I feel like it's on iOS at this point, but I don't know. So it'd be interesting to see what we could do for Hypercore on that front. Let's see. All right, next challenge we're going to tackle is DNS. How do we get a human-friendly URL situation that people are used to without starting another doomed monopoly? Shout out, Johan says, shout out to freyfunk.net. I think that's how that's pronounced. I will definitely check that out after the presentation. Thank you for the link. But yeah, so for the DNS, I think a useful principle here is what can be described as collaborative subjectivity. Similar to how we conceptualize truths already as humans, intangible concepts don't exist in any observable way, but we are able to establish, collectively agreed upon signifiers, words that people around us just kind of understand what we mean, what we're pointing to. This principle is already, being practiced in Cabal subjective moderation that they did a demo of yesterday, and I think it worked really nicely, in a DNS setup, or even identity verification as well. As far as the specifics of that, I think that's definitely something that us browsers can, talk about further. But I think it's very realistic to go for the distributed approach on this one. Okay, so the last question is of adoption, and I want to break it into two questions. So first is, how do you get more people to build on the ecosystem while trying to avoid market incentives? This is a pretty big question. Part of what allows us to develop radical solutions is that the voluntary and community-ran nature of the data ecosystem. It doesn't adhere as much to things like capital interests. I mean, but since capitalism is hegemonic, it's not avoidable. And the vast majority of people who may like to participate but can't afford to volunteer their labor, there's a barrier there, But what I think we can do as people who are capable of developing these solutions right now is trying to minimize the gap between the role of user and developer, basically making development as accessible as possible. And I mean this in a few senses. On one hand, I think creating educational resources would be extremely helpful for people who are just that just want to dive into the programming directly. And then there's the other side of the coin, which is pairing development tools with what would normally be seen as just a mode of consumption. So kind of subverting expectations there. I would say Beaker is a shining example of this. I'd never touched HTML before I tried out Beaker, and I think part of why I did with Beaker is just because the transition was very seamless. There was just no friction there. I was like, oh, okay, cool. No, yeah, this is no big deal. Let me just play around with this. And there's still room for us to take it a step further with more like, robust visual tools that can be, very simple and approachable on the surface, but allow users to go down the rabbit hole into touching actual code as they feel more comfortable. Like I remember, when I was first learning mobile development, I started on iOS as opposed to Android, because at the time, Xcode had visual tools that were very intuitive and easy to work with. And as my development needs became more complex, I was just able to transition naturally. All right, let's see. Oh yeah, let's see. But even with the educational resources and tools, who are we reaching out to? And what's the dynamic here? In other words, what's the mode we're operating on? So let's see. Community-oriented mutual reinforcement. That's a mouthful of a bunch of words that I just said. We'll break that down. It sounds like that to me, which isn't like this isn't like an academic term or anything. It's just how I thought to describe the type of collaboration I'm going for. The thought is that focusing on building solidarity between participants rather than focusing on what is produced. Will create a foundation that's more resistant to liberal recuperation and will be more compatible with kind of the long-term peer-to-peer vision. And the mutual reinforcement is what kind of informs who we're approaching. Specifically, people who have shared interests in kind of the larger structural things that we're doing. If you remember from the big scary model that I showed earlier, things like the web, the internet, and the technology and energy industries are all tentacles that connect to the same larger octopus of like hegemonic power, basically. Which means that we have shared interests with people and organizations that are either building alternative structures or subverting the existing ones directly in a manner that's compatible with the principles that inform our work. A really good example is agroecology, which Don Blair will be talking about later today. And existing projects like Mapio and Move's recent work on Natakanu are also, really good examples of building systems of solidarity with indigenous people that can kind of begin the dialectical process, basically circularly changing each other through which a synthesis can occur, between the two. And there's many, axes, and as far as marginalization and oppression is concerned, even Mauve mentioned earlier the IWW, which stands for the Industrial Workers of the World. They're a union organization, and I think any organizations like them are great candidates. I think that there's a lot of shared fundamental interest there in terms of like generating a force. And these more radical suggestions aside, I do think that there's even on higher levels in these structures that we live in, the ones that we kind of engage with more and more, more commonly. Like for example, one that has a close place to my heart is video game modding communities. I just think it's really fun and cool when people who enjoy a particular form of expression can collaborate and build on their idea of it, basically. And they can definitely benefit from what we're doing as well. So yeah, I just wanted to throw out a range of examples to get anyone who's kind of looking for a space to work with, something to think about or apply. Okay, let's wrap this part up, or just this talk part up, and then if we have time, we can do like some back and forth. So yeah, I really do think that that the DAT community is already on the right track towards building a web that carries over what made the web beautiful in the first place. And I think it'll be able to overcome a climate that isn't very friendly towards it. So I'm not actually very concerned But there's a lot to do. But like all processes that we can observe, a structure may seem to be static or excruciating slow to change, but as soon as a critical point is reached, the quality of that structure changes almost instantly. And if you're new to this space and you're looking for a place to get started, hopefully this talk gave you a few possible ideas on where to jump in, or at least got you thinking in terms that could maybe lead you to what you want to work on. So yeah, thanks for listening. And do we have time for questions? See a few questions in the chat that I missed.
Yeah, we have like 5 minutes for questions.
5 minutes? Okay, yeah. Cool. Let's see if I can point out. So Jeremy asked, Jeremy went offline, but they asked, why do you associate DNS with recapitulating monopolistic anti-patterns in the context of the mobile browser? I was speaking, I guess I should have been clear since like that was right after the mobile browser. I was speaking in a more like general sense, but in terms of the monopolistic anti-patterns, I don't think DNS inherently is monopolistic. It might have just been my lack of clarity in me introducing the topic. But I was just saying, like, we should be cautious to avoid it. But I do think that, again, like the kind of collaborative subjectivity between, what's it called? I guess applications that are using this stack. I think that through that, there can be a really efficient DNS system that kind of doesn't depend on sort of a centralized authority. Let's see, do you see peer-to-peer web as necessarily revolutionary and breaking with the traditional web, or as an evolution that extends it? That's a very good question, Boxpelly. So I guess coming at it from like a materialist sense, it's kind of like the way I just kind of frame it is what we're doing is, so we're starting in the current structure of the internet and the web extending from that, and what the current web has been able to manage up until this, through to this point, is incredible. Like a lot of like the technologies that are very open and accessible, despite the kind of the forces that kind of create these like large platforms, that's where they kind of pull everyone in. But anyway, so I think with the technology we're developing, it's more like we're changing the composition, of the structure. So we're creating, so I guess the idea is like we're creating new alternatives that hopefully can propagate and kind of spread out through the ecosystem. And then just kind of as those quantities reach a critical point, I think it'll be kind of like how you see with like kind of like, for example, like transition between like feudalism and capitalism, right? It's like there was just kind of a bunch of quantitative changes within that like happened over time just because of like the material conditions in feudalism, that eventually there was a point where it's just like, oh, this is a different thing. We call this a different thing now. It operates fundamentally kind of differently. Does that make sense? I guess it's maybe a little more, it's a fluid sounding. See some typing, so see what's up. Have you run into any networking or connectivity issues on mobile? Yeah, that's a great question, Mov. I have run into, there's a couple quirks that we're currently trying to iron out. Namely, it seems that there's kind of, last I tested at least, I don't think I'm on the newest, like all the newest modules for the hyperstack right now. But there seems to be like a kind of inconsistency in replicating on cellular networks. But actually, Mo, you'll appreciate this. What I did as an early workaround when I was trying to use the cell networks is actually I used your Hyperswarm web, and I basically like mashed it into the core store swarm networking, like just like a custom version of the module. So that way, basically, if the device was kind of doing both, and so like on my Android device, if I replicated it, then the iOS device, could use Hyperstorm Web to still replicate with it. It's of course not like a a solid solution, but it was a fun little dirty trick like when I was testing it early on. Oh, you did the same thing? Oh, that's awesome. Did I miss anything? Makes sense. Yes. To what extent do you see P2P gaining adoption inside corporations? I want to see it happen where the application is appropriate. Ooh, this is a good question. I guess internally, there's a lot of like benefits that P2P brings, even like for a corporation. There's like there's definitely, I think, security benefits. It's they don't have to be kind of connected to the larger ClearNet, which is like a good security perk. But I don't know. But I guess like that's distributed systems, right? Which is already kind of a thing. So I don't know how much, because I guess like that's the distinction, right? Is like there's distributed, which is like everything's kind of interconnected. Peer-to-peer specifically, like each node in that network is a peer. So like like there's more like a even set of privileges there. So I feel like corporations already kind of have, like, I think they're good with distributed, maybe. I don't know about peer-to-peer specifically. Unless, assuming I'm getting the terminology right. Yes, Wi-Fi mesh, or like long range Wi-Fi. Is that, I know it's long range. I forget what WAN stands for. I definitely think if we can, both. As far as the mobile device is concerned, I believe it only supports a wide area network. Thank you. So the mobile devices antennas, I believe, it's only supports, or it only provides a regular Wi-Fi, not a long range. But there was what's the name of it? Disaster Radio has a really good, if you all are familiar with them, they have a really good affordable, like I guess like a tutorial rig that like you can like buy the parts yourself, and it's a combination of low range wide area network as well as Wi-Fi, and just kind of it just understands to use whichever one is appropriate given like the distance between nodes. Let's see, Moab says, I think we need IPv6 support sooner than later to support stuff like CJDNS. Yeah, IPv6, it slaps. It's really good. I am in full support. Let's see, it would be really nice to land, yeah. Let's see.
Good. Well, it was awesome. I guess, yeah, I guess that we are on time. I'd like to say thanks, Rad, for this great talk. And I guess that the topic is really interesting for all of us. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Well, coming up next, we will have Mob with an introduction to Aggregor, a minimal peer-to-peer web browser.